Thank you for the kind introduction. I will speak about the problems of power politics in the contemporary context, as the chairman has already indicated. Allow me to begin with an afterthought on the occasion that brings us together in this august building, dedicated, as the inscription says here, dem deutschen Volk, to the German people. We are commemorating today the collapse of a wall, an event that symbolized the end of the division of Europe, and we do so at a moment in a year when a new wall appears to rise on our continent and in the minds of its peoples, a wall which again divides countries and their citizens along spheres of interest. A new East-West conflict seems to take shape that affects the entire world and poses the threat of a major conflagration, a risk not faced by humanity since the Cuban Missile Crisis 60 years ago. Though the war in Ukraine is not the only cause of this geopolitical development, it is almost its most dramatic expression and consequence. That's my assessment. This conflict did not erupt out of nowhere. There is an uninterrupted legacy of great power rivalry in Europe since the end of the Second World War. The global power struggle, a symptom of the collective greed for power, has always been accompanied by what I call the deceptive and delusional arrogance of the great powers, for which a more adequate German term, by the way, would be Übermut, because it also means the overbearing self-confidence of powers and their leaders. The examples abound also in the recent history of international relations. We just need to remember the sequence of humiliating retreats from Afghanistan, 1989, a retreat of the Soviet Union, 2021, just last year, retreat of the United States. Looking back further in history, one may contemplate Napoleon's invasion of Russia and his subsequent flight from Moscow under circumstances of panic and chaos, as they were epically described by Leo Tolstoy in War and Peace. Despite the cultural boycott of everything Russian here in Europe, I do highly recommend to everyone to read this volume, especially in this year, 2022, and not to give in to this hysterical cultural boycott, which we are faced with now all over, at least Western Europe. It is as if the lessons of history are never learned. The greed for power, accompanied by overconfidence and a lack of self-restraint, again and again has been at the roots of the peculiar irrationality of collective behavior. To a considerable extent, this also appears to be at the origin of the present conflict in and over Ukraine, which from the outset has also been a proxy war between the United States and the collective West on the one side and Russia on the other. The geopolitical escalation that preceded the outbreak of hostilities, I mean Russia's invasion of Ukraine, was fueled by a struggle for power on both sides that triggered a chain, as they say in America, of unintended consequences. I mean consequences those two powers did not foresee themselves. On the Western side, it was the overconfidence after the events of 1989, already spoken about by the previous speaker, and after the end of the Cold War, that nurtured a kind of triumphalism and false eschatological pathos in the proclamations of a so-called New World Order. Francis Fukuyama's announcement of the end of history was indeed, as we now can say in hindsight, the most spectacular misdiagnosis upon the end of the East-West conflict. In the wake of those proclamations, New World Order, end of history, and so on, the military interventionism in the 2 decades around the turn of the millennium and the steady expansion of strategic influence of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization towards the East have profoundly destabilized regional order in the wider Europe. In spite of the fundamental change in the balance of power, indeed of the collapse of the balance of power to the benefit of the West, the adversarial mindset of the Cold War, embodied in the earlier policy of containment of the Soviet Union, prevailed also in the new geopolitical context. The analysis of NATO expansion towards the East would indeed make a perfect case study of great power arrogance. Because unlike Fukuyama's diagnosis, it was a sober and precise prediction of the things to come. I would like to quote here in more detail the warning words of the main architect of the policy of containment, namely George F. Kennan, United States ambassador to the Soviet Union after World War II and the first director of policy planning under President Truman. Commenting on the plans for NATO expansion, Mr. Kennan, in an article published in 1997 in the New York Times, bluntly stated, quote, that expanding NATO would be the most fateful error of American policy in the entire post-Cold War era. Such a decision, he continued, may be expected to inflame the nationalistic, anti-Western, and militaristic tendencies in Russian opinion, to have an adverse effect on the development of Russian democracy, to restore the atmosphere of the Cold War to East-West relations, and to impel Russian foreign policy in directions decidedly not to our, United States, liking. Mr. Kennan further said that such a move would be, quote, doubly unfortunate considering the total lack of any necessity for this move, end quote. As we now must admit, George Kennan's warning was a precise premonition of the things to come. Collective hubris after victory in the Cold War had prevailed over the caution of an elder statesman. Unfortunately, we must say now. For the historical record, by the way, one may add here that Russia considered NATO expansion as a breach of confidence. In an interview for the German Bild newspaper in 2009, which Bild only partly published, in this interview, Mikhail Gorbachev, the last leader of the Soviet Union, said that Western Germany, the United States, and other powers had pledged after Germany's reunification in 1990 that NATO would not move a centimeter to the east, and that was put as a quote by Gorbachev. The Gorbachev Foundation's report on this interview further reads, and I quote, Gorbachev said the Americans had failed to fulfill the promise. And the article, as I said, is still available, accessible on the website of the Gorbachev Foundation in Moscow, an article dated 2nd April 2009, entitled "Gorbachev Blasts NATO Eastward Expansion." And it's important to make this point here because the interview has not been published in full length here in German language by the German side, by Bild. My conversations with President Gorbachev at an international peace conference in Istanbul in December 2012, around 10 years ago, confirmed this interpretation. More recently, in a report issued in 2019 entitled "Overextending and Unbalancing Russia," that's the title, the RAND Corporation, a think tank established in 1948 by Douglas Aircraft Company to provide research to the United States Armed Forces, suggested as one of several options that, and again I quote, "the United States might goad Russia into a costly arms race by breaking out of the nuclear arms control regime," end quote. It is hard to imagine a strategic approach that would be more confrontational and peace-threatening than this so-called cost-imposing measure, to use the terminology of the RAND report. It is obvious that such a strategic mindset almost unavoidably provoked a new Cold War confrontation with Russia, which is now playing out in Ukraine, and which may trigger further global repercussions due to this geopolitical repositioning of the collective West. Also, we honestly must admit that the conflict of 2022, of this year, can only be understood in this broader context. There is a history of meddling in Ukrainian affairs, even since before the dramatic events of the Euromaidan around the turn of 2013, 2014, and the Maidan Revolution, or Revolution of Dignity, as it is called in Ukraine, in February 2014, and the subsequent unconstitutional change, or overthrow, as they say here, of government in that country, on the details of which there is no time here to comment. And there is a history of extreme nationalist sentiments, undeniably. A history of the suppression of the Russian language in Ukraine and of the continued non-implementation of the Minsk II agreement of 2015 concerning constitutional measures that would secure the rights of the people in the Russian-speaking territories in the east of the country. And I remember quite well, just a few years ago, in the year of the last presidential elections in Ukraine, I had a conversation with the longtime Minister of the Interior of Ukraine, who was also a presidential candidate exactly about this issue. And I asked him why they would not consider ultimately just to implement those provisions. The answer was a very strict no, that they would never, ever consider to do anything about constitutional reform in terms of federalism and autonomy for the East. On the Russian side, too, deceptive great power arrogance has been obvious all along in the nurturing of a kind of imperial nostalgia since the dissolution of the Soviet Union, a dream that could not and cannot be fulfilled under the prevailing geopolitical circumstances. The apparent illusion on the part of Russia about the consequences of challenging the post-Cold War status quo in Ukraine has now led to a dangerous escalation of an initially, at least, domestic conflict. The draft treaty and draft agreement submitted on the 17th of December last year by Russia to the United States and NATO, respectively, actually were a kind of ultimatum to the Western side, of which Russia was aware that it would be rejected. The tactical move after a long stalemate over NATO expansion, was based on a self-delusional assessment of Russia's position and capacity to counter the Western reaction to military intervention in Ukraine, labeling the war conducted, certainly in violation of the UN Charter, as a so-called special military operation, was another expression of denial of reality, typical of great power arrogance. Turkey, when making the necessary legal determination under the Montreux Convention concerning navigation in the Straits, was not impressed. Turkey was not impressed by this definition and identified the hostilities in Ukraine right away as war, according to the convention. And accordingly, Turkey closed the straits to the warships of the two belligerent powers, as it is obliged to do under the convention. Furthermore, when President Putin convened a meeting of the Russian Security Council on the 21st of February this year, that means 3 days before the invasion, consulting with the members of the Council about recognition of the secessionist territories in eastern Ukraine as sovereign states, he completely ignored, for everybody to see, the meeting was broadcast live on Russian TV, he ignored the doubts and reservations of at least 2 members of the Council, including the Chief of Foreign Intelligence, who suggested that Russia, hesitatingly, but anyhow, suggested that Russia should still wait a few more days before such a fateful step and should try to renegotiate. The President treated those who timidly suggested a more cautious approach almost like schoolboys and brusquely confronted them with a yes or no option with nothing in between. Another symptom of deceptive arrogance, I would say, of great power rule. And luckily, I was able to circumvent the Western cultural and information boycott with the help of internet software. So I was able, otherwise I would not have this information because practically nobody has this information. Nobody was able to watch that session. But thanks to a VPN, virtual private network, there is a possibility to circumvent censorship here in Europe. However, when we try to grasp the dynamics of a conflict such as the war in and over Ukraine, there is no simple scheme. I hope that is clear by now. There is no simple scheme of black and white or of good versus evil, and even less so when we look at the military record of the protagonists. Vilification of the opponent may be a common feature of armed conflict, but it always blurs the vision and weakens strategic assessment on both sides, and it narrows the options for compromise based on a rational balancing of risks and interests. That's what the great powers could learn from the writings, for instance, of Henry Kissinger, what that means. War, in my assessment, could have been avoided if both sides would have kept to the parameters of compromise they were able to agree upon in Minsk not so long ago, I mean 7 years ago, but not an eternity ago, in 2015. If Ukraine, encouraged by the leaders of Germany and France, would have implemented, as I said before, the specific autonomy provisions of Minsk II for the Russian majority regions in the east of the country, the gradual escalation over these 7 years from a regional towards a full-scale international conflict might have been prevented by not reining in extremist nationalist groups with Nazi sympathies, such as the Azov battalion, and by persistently refusing implementation of the Minsk agreements, Ukraine gave Russia not a justification, certainly not, but a pretext to invade. To the credit of President Zelensky, it must be said, however, that early on in his term, he tried to convince the Azov leaders to keep out of politics. It is documented on video. He did not succeed, as we know. Though it sounds almost like a platitude, it is geopolitical common sense to call upon the parties to return to the negotiating table and to seek a compromise on the basis of the principles or the points tentatively agreed upon in the earlier talks on the Belarus-Ukraine border and in Istanbul. Unfortunately, a resumption of negotiations will be much more difficult now because of the de facto Russian annexation of Donetsk, Luhansk, and Zaporizhia oblasts in the eastern border region. This happened in the vacuum left by the suspended negotiations under Turkish mediation, where Ukraine had presented a constructive 10-point, what they called at the time, Istanbul communiqué, on the 29th of March this year. These proposals would, inter alia, have included permanent neutrality of Ukraine, backed up by international security guarantees. So what way forward under these circumstances? What's the way forward? And that brings me to my concluding reflections. Because ending the war by way of a military defeat of Russia, the strongest nuclear power as of today, is neither a realistic prospect in terms of geopolitics nor a responsible option in terms of morality. The only reasonable and prudent approach will be a negotiated balancing of the conflicting interests at the domestic, bilateral, and international levels. With the help of honest brokers such as Turkey, the antagonists should agree on an overall framework of principles that form part of today's global consensus expressed in the Charter of the United Nations and other international covenants of which both states, Russia and Ukraine, are parties. Domestically and bilaterally, a sustainable solution needs to be based on what nowadays one fashionably always calls democratic inclusion. That means on the equal participation of all national minorities in the political process in Ukraine. This would have to include implementation of the so-called package of measures agreed upon in Minsk concerning recognition of the Russian language and local self-rule in the eastern regions. It is worthy of note that the package of measures which is attached to Minsk II resembles in great detail the so-called South Tyrol package, the package of measures for autonomy in German-speaking South Tyrol, which was agreed upon between Austria and Italy several decades ago. This agreement successfully ended the dispute between the two countries, Austria and Italy, over the rights of the Tyrolean minority in Italy. It might be of interest to the conflicting parties now to study the details. What adds to the complexity and confusion of the bilateral conflict between Ukraine and Russia, however, is the status of the right of self-determination under modern international law. Namely, in fact, since the time when President Woodrow Wilson introduced this idea and principle as a structuring principle of the international order after World War I. As things stand now, the approach of the international community seems to be one of double standards concerning self-determination. Self-determination is invoked depending on circumstances of power and opportunity, not on the basis of an unequivocal legal concept. The different treatment of the developments concerning Kosovo and Crimea is a case in point. There is no need to give any further explanation. Internationally or globally, The basic principle for resolution of the conflict will be what Ukraine has already addressed in the Istanbul Communiqué, namely a status of permanent military neutrality, similar to the status of Switzerland or Austria. This alone will prevent a situation where Ukraine continues to be a pawn on the grand chessboard, to borrow a term from Zbigniew Brzezinski, on the grand chessboard of geopolitical rivalry between the United States, with the European Union in tandem on the one side and Russia on the other. This time, however, the neutral status of Ukraine would need to be backed up by robust security guarantees by the United Nations P5, the 5 permanent members of the Security Council, possibly joined by Turkey as major regional power. What was described as the security guarantees of the Budapest Memorandum of 1994, after Ukraine had committed itself to a nuclear-free status, were mere assurances. Furthermore, non-interference in the internal affairs will be another principle that is indispensable for a sustainable solution to the conflict. The geopolitical antagonists or competitors will need to reach a kind of gentleman's agreement on not interfering in the domestic disputes in Ukraine. According to the understanding reached upon the end of the Cold War, to which I have already referred earlier, they should, on the basis of mutuality, also stick to the principle of not encroaching on each other's security domain, particularly as regards NATO enlargement after the dissolution of the Warsaw Pact. And the world should know how important that is since the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. Also, both sides, the United States and Russia, must be aware that a thermonuclear showdown would defeat the very purpose of their power struggle. In view of what military strategists of the Cold War described as the threat of mutual assured destruction, MIAD, it would be an act of strategic irrationality par excellence. And we should not forget in that regard the solemn warning of President John Fitzgerald Kennedy in his peace speech of 1963. In a strategic quandary such as this one, neutral states may play a constructive role in terms of mediation in the search of compromise, but also of providing a venue for negotiations. As far as the latter is concerned, unfortunately, Switzerland and Austria, having thrown away their time-tested neutral status in the case of the Ukraine conflict, are not likely candidates anymore. Unlike these supposedly permanently neutral countries, Turkey, a member of NATO since 1952, has proven to follow a constructive neutral approach vis-à-vis Russia and Ukraine, and thus enjoys credibility in the eyes of the two protagonists as well as of the international community, to host peace talks and to act as facilitator of negotiations. To serve a useful role in such a context, a country does not need to have a status of permanent neutrality enshrined in its constitution. What is decisive is factual neutrality in the respective conflict situation. The large prisoner swap between the warring parties in September of this year is proof of the constructive role of Turkey, as is the so-called grain deal, grain diplomacy, mediated and rescued so far in the midst of the fighting by Turkey, under UN auspices also, but essentially by Turkey. What may be small steps in relation to the larger picture of war are nonetheless encouraging signs indicating that even in an entrenched conflict such as this one, the antagonists, with the help of a mediator, that carries the necessary weight can escape the logic of war in a moment of reason or soberness that may convince them of the virtues of diplomacy as sustainable alternative to a conflict protracted ad infinitum. There is one important caveat, however, and that's my concluding sentence. Mediation in this sense can only be successful if and as long as third parties keep out of the conflict. That means if the arrogance of geopolitical maneuvering can be held in check. The fate of Ukraine and of Europe, by the way, must not be decided on the chessboard of Machiavellian power politics. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Dr. Köchler. That was concise, precise, and brilliant. I think you have inspired us all, maybe provoked us all as well. We have different views on this issue this morning, so I'd be happy to take, even though we're running over time, at least one or two comments or questions. Maybe try to keep the comments, questions brief, the responses brief, and then we can hear even more. Who would like to raise their hand? Yes, please.
Don't know how this works. Okay. Hi. Thank you very much, Dr. Köchler, for your words. I found them really interesting. I just had a question for further thoughts of yours. You mentioned that the only way to fix this conflict would be a compromise from both sides. My question is, would it really be a compromise with such a direct nuclear and military threat present? Do you not see that as a form of coercion rather than like a coercion to compromise, but not a compromise more on the side of Russia than Ukraine?
If we speak of a compromise, it needs two sides, and there must be a balance. There must be a balancing of interests. Otherwise, it would be what one calls a diktat, by the German word diktat, dictate. One side dictating to the other the conditions. And a compromise usually can be envisaged at a moment when both sides realize that continuing the conflict or trying to fight it out until the bitter end, as we have seen in the Second World War, will ultimately do more damage to them and to their own interests and to the long-term prosperity of the country. But of course, now there is one big problem as far as the compromise is concerned. It was much easier at the beginning of the conflict in March when the International Progress Organization, with which I'm affiliated, published that blueprint for peace of Ukraine. Now there is a new fait accompli, which was not there in March, namely that these eastern territories now have been formally annexed by Russia, have been incorporated into Russia. So, because otherwise the compromise would have been and that is what we had suggested, to have an internationally supervised referendum over the status of Crimea, according to the right of self-determination, and to fully implement the Minsk agreements, because these agreements were made between Russia and Ukraine and were endorsed, of course, by Ukraine. And that would have meant the full status of autonomy for the Russian-speaking territories in the east. But now, of course, it is much more difficult. But anyhow, because of the nuclear threat, that's what President Kennedy warned in 1963. Because of the nuclear threat, there is almost no other option than sitting down and at the table and negotiating.
Thank you. Maybe one more comment or question, please.
Thank you, Professor, for the explanation. I assume that's a very pragmatic approach to the conflict, but it was very nice. My question is what you think will be the fate of UN Security Council, because I assume that it is unable to be reformed, nor to be disbanded. I see it as a shipwreck left without any power when it comes to the issues that touch the interest of the permanent members. So what do you think will be the fate of Security Council? Thank you.
Under the Charter, this situation in Ukraine would be a classical case for the United Nations to practice its system of collective security, as it is called. Namely, it would be up to the Security Council to take measures that are legally binding on the two parties and on all member states, coercive measures for to end the conflict. But there is a structural problem in the Charter of the United Nations. The Security Council is paralyzed on that particular conflict, as in matters of any other conflict, if a permanent member is party to the conflict. So in this case, Russia can veto any decision, any binding decision of the Security Council on ending the war. But that's not it's certainly not the first time where we have such a situation of paralysis of the Security Council. There were many other instances where the main issue was the veto of another permanent member and not of Russia. But the structural problem cannot be solved because the Charter of the United Nations has this flaw built into it, that a permanent member has the right to block any decision, and a permanent member may use this right and may vote, may issue a veto, may vote no to a resolution, also if it is itself a member to the dispute. According to the Charter, concerning all other matters which are not related to resolutions that are not binding, but that are recommendations, any member, including a permanent member, must abstain from voting if it is involved in the dispute. That's natural. But concerning matters of peace and security under Chapter 7, I mean, matters that are legally binding, there is no such restriction. So any country that invades another country, if it is in the Security Council, can vote. And for that reason, nothing can be expected of the United Nations except in the other matter of humanitarian action, which can be coordinated by the Secretary General and on which he is also active. But nothing decisive concerning peace.
Well, thank you very much. I have many questions and comments. You probably do as well, but in the name of time, unfortunately, I think we do need to proceed to the next speaker. But let's first express our sincere gratitude. Professor Dr. Hans Köchler.